Hello and welcome to Value Research Helpline. I'm Ruchira and our experts here at Value Research are now all set to answer your queries on investing and personal finance. Joining us is Ashutosh Gupta, who heads the mutual fund research team at Value Research and works closely on developing new services and initiatives at Value Research. Welcome, Ashutosh.
Thank you, Ruchira.
Today's first question has been sent in by Jatinder, who wants to know if disciplined investment in mutual funds through SIP over the long term will help him create wealth.
Yes, of course. SIPs are meant to precisely do that. They are meant to help you stay the course and ride through the ups and downs of the market over the long term. And once you are able to do that, then there are fairly high chances of you earning a reasonably good rate of returns through equity investing. Now, let me show some numbers to bring a little bit of conviction into this thinking. So what you see on your screen are returns from SIP investing in multi-cap funds over blocks of 10 years. So the first value that you see on this chart starts from somewhere in 2017. So the period covered for this value would be period from 2007 to 2017. So this 10-year block and returns derived from it by an investor through the SIP mode of investing. And what you see here are the maximum returns that one could have made from a fund in a multi-cap category, the average ones, and the minimum ones. And likewise, every point on this line represents the 10-year SIP returns up till that date. So that's how you can read this graph. Now, if you see that over these years, there was a high probability that you could have made SIP returns at a CAGR of about anywhere between 10 to 15%. And that's good enough. Now, of course, selectivity matters because in the worst case scenario, there was a possibility of you earning negative returns at the time of the sharp market fall in March last year. That was the worst case scenario that was there. But again, when the markets recovered swiftly, so did the SIP returns. But the broad point is that yes, there is a fairly good chance of you earning good returns through SIP investing. And you can look at this graph and decide for yourself if these numbers look compelling enough to you. But having said that, we need to move beyond numbers and Excel spreadsheets when we talk about generating wealth over a long period of time. You would need to do a little more things than simply do your SIP investing. One is that you'll have to be disciplined and be at it and continue investing through the ups and downs of the market, because often what people do is to selectively stop and start their SIPs, which works to their detriment over a long term. So that's number one. Second is you have to be able to commit a reasonable amount of money to be able to generate any meaningful wealth. So for instance, you would come across investors who would be earning well over say a lakh of rupees a month or even more, but they would be doing an SIP of rupees 5,000 per month. Now, even if they remain disciplined through their investing journey, and even if they end up earning handsome rates of return, probably it will not make a meaningful difference to their financial well-being, given the scale of their investment in the context of their financial circumstances. So it's important for you to be investing a reasonable sum of money in the context of your financial situation to generate meaningful wealth that makes a difference to your life. So that's very important. And the third thing is that you should look to increase your SIP amounts along with the increase in your income, because often what happens is that you start investing a reasonable sum of money in the market, but over a period of time your income increases, and if your SIP investments don't keep pace with it, then again you can land up in that same rupees 5,000 investment with a 1 lakh rupee salary kind of a situation, which is avoidable. So once you take care of these things, you are all set.
All right, so stay on course and continue with your SIP through the ups and downs. Now, K. Venkata Subbarao wants you to elaborate on expense ratio. He asks, is NAV inclusive of expense ratio? Also, exactly at what stage are the expenses deducted?
Okay, so first of all, you can think of expense ratio as the cost that a fund company charges you for the services it's providing to you. And on top of it, there could be certain additional costs added to it, like the distributor's commission, in case we are talking about the regular plan. So in a nutshell, that's what an expense ratio is. Now, The expense ratio is not charged on a particular day in an year. It is charged on a drip by drip basis every single day from the NAV. And the NAV that you see that the fund discloses every day is after charging for the expense ratio. So for instance, if a fund is charging 1% of its AUM as the expense ratio, then this 1% is not charged on a particular day, but every single day, a very small proportion of this 1% is charged from the NAV. And after charging that, the NAV is disclosed. Uh, Beyond NAV, there are a few other nominal charges that you would have to bear. For instance, at the time of buying the fund, you have to incur a stamp duty, which is at the rate of rupees 5 per rupees lakh of investment. And likewise, at the time of selling, there is a securities transaction tax that has to be paid, which is at the rate of 0.001% in case of equity funds. So those are the pretty nominal charges which sit outside of the expense ratio. Otherwise, expense ratio factors in your overall cost of ownership of the mutual fund units, and the returns that you calculate basis the NAV are the actual returns that you get, because as I just explained, the expense ratio has already been factored into while calculating the NAV.
All right, now Pratap says, Value Research recommends short-term debt funds for a duration of more than 1 year. Please explain how do these funds manage interest rate risk and credit risk? Recently, they're showing negative returns. Also, he's asked for your suggestion on alternatives to it for capital protection.
Well, as far as interest rate risk is concerned, it is fairly range bound in case of short duration funds. That's because by regulatory mandate, short duration funds cannot keep the duration or the maturity of their portfolio beyond 3 years. They are mandated to always keep the duration of the portfolio in a tight range of 1 to 3 years. Now, typically what happens is that interest rate risk happens to be higher in case of bonds or in case of funds which invest in longer tenured bonds. And those are the ones which witness more severe ups and downs in their value in response to any changes in the interest rates. But because short duration funds by mandate have to keep their duration at a pretty short range of 1 to 3 years, that's why that impact is fairly limited. In fact, if you look at as the events have unfolded since the start of this year, the bond yields have headed northwards. They've increased since the start of the year, and because of which bond funds have delivered negative returns, as he rightly pointed out. But the magnitude of negative returns has differed across different categories of debt funds. The gilt funds have been the most impacted, which have seen value erosion to the tune of about 1% or higher. Dynamic bond funds, for instance, have seen negative returns of about 0.8%, while short duration funds have delivered negative returns of about half a percentage point. And that's in line with the kind of average maturities that these kind of funds maintain in their portfolios. So to answer that question shortly, the impact of interest rate movements in case of short duration funds is fairly narrow and fairly range bound in comparison to some of the other categories which invest in bonds of much longer duration. Now, coming to credit risk, that is where there is no regulatory mandate on short duration funds, and that's where different funds can differ differently. Now, if you look at the current portfolios of short duration funds, then all of them appear to have a fairly high quality portfolio in terms of the credit rating of the bonds that they invest in. But this is not always the case. If we go travel back in time a little bit, we would spot wide differences in the credit quality of the portfolios. Some funds were taking aggressive credit calls by investing substantially in bonds of lower credit quality. So that's an aspect which investors would need to monitor and keep track of periodically to see what is the kind of credit exposure their short duration fund is taking. And in fact, the newly revamped riskometer that has been unveiled by SEBI since January can also help investors gauge the element of risk in their funds and track it on an ongoing basis. Now, coming to the second part of his question, short duration funds are generally suitable for an investment horizon of over 1 year. Of course, over shorter time frames of a few weeks to a few months, they can witness volatility, they can witness negative returns in response to the movements in the interest rates. But over that kind of an investment horizon, they are a fairly suitable category to invest in.
Rashid Mohammed has sent in the next question, and he asks, what is the ideal age to buy a house for a salaried person? He's 22 years old and lives in a rented accommodation. So should he save most of the income for down payment to buy a house in the next 3 years, or postpone it and invest in equity funds?
Well, I don't think I can provide a precise answer to his question, because I don't think there is a standard answer for everybody over here. But let me try and provide a perspective of the kind of considerations that he should keep in mind, the kind of things he should think about while taking this decision, and hopefully it helps him arrive at the right decision. So one is that while buying a house, it's perhaps the most significant expenditure that one incurs in his lifetime, simply because of the ticket size that is involved here. And one typically ends up assuming a big financial liability in terms of a home loan, which has to be serviced over a long period of time on a monthly basis. So one of the key considerations before one gets into it is to think about uh, how settled one is professionally, how stable is one in his job, and therefore his stream of income. So that is one thing that he should think about, that at this age, does he think he's well settled professionally, or he would reach that stage in the next 2 to 3 years. That's point number one. Second is that while incurring an EMI, one should not end up, it should not lead one into an ultra cost cutting mode. We generally believe that your EMI should not be more than a third of your monthly income, because by doing that, it should leave a reasonable headroom to take care of your other expenses, and hopefully also be able to save for some of the other goals. So that is the other consideration to keep in mind, that how big a component would an EMI be of your monthly income. And the third important consideration one should keep in mind is that what is the kind of credit worthiness one has. So do you have a reasonable bank balance already? What is the kind of net worth you have? Because these are the kind of considerations that a bank takes into account while deciding what is the kind of rate of interest it is willing to offer to you. So higher your credit worthiness, the better or lower the rate of interest that you can get as a deal from the bank. So those are the kind of considerations that you should think about. Also, some of these factors move beyond the purely financial ones. For instance, a lot of people like to defer the decision to buy a house until they are married, because they want that to be a joint decision with their life partner, and they want their spouse to play an equally important role in deciding about buying a house. So once they are married, they can mutually think about what are their life goals, where would they like to settle down, what is the kind of accommodation they would want to raise their family. And these are also very important considerations to keep in mind before you take that decision. So broadly, I suggest reflect upon these things, think about these factors, and hopefully you are able to decide for yourself whether right now it is an opportune time for you to go for it, or you would like to defer it.
That's right. Think hard before you make a move to buy a house, because that is one of the biggest financial expenditures you might end up doing. Now, Rohit Kumar Singh wants to know, when should an investor invest in index funds, in a bull market or during market falls?
Well, the bull or the bear phase of the market has nothing to do with your decision to invest in index funds or not. First and the foremost is that you should have a long-term horizon, and you should be able to withstand the ups and downs that the equity market is bound to deliver over a long time frame. So those are the foremost preconditions that one should keep in mind before deciding about investing in equity in the first place, whether active or passive. Now, talking specifically about index funds, they certainly have some advantages to offer. One is the simplicity of choice, because while choosing an index fund, all that matters is a combination of low costs and a low tracking error. So that can be of great appeal to a new investor who wants to save himself from the stress of or the nuances of going about choosing a fund. An index fund greatly simplifies that choice for him. So that's one. The second is they are also very suitable for a conservative investor who is largely looking to get exposure to the large cap segment of the market, because that's a segment where index funds have done fairly well and the actively managed funds have had a tough time matching up to the returns of the index funds. In fact, if you look at those comparisons, if you look at the performance of actively managed funds in the recent years, you would notice that 2018 was a watershed year in that respect, when virtually none of the actively managed large cap funds were able to beat the Sensex. Now they've been able to claw back their way a little bit in the subsequent calendar years, but still the number of outperformers is lower than the underperformers. So from that perspective, certainly index funds have been giving a tough time to the actively managed funds. And certainly one area where actively managed funds cannot match up to the index funds is in terms of costs, because with an index fund, you can get a reasonably diversified exposure to the large cap universe of stocks for as low as 10 to 15 basis points of costs. So that is a big advantage. And therefore, for investors who are looking to get exposure to the large cap segment of the market at wafer thin costs, index funds can be the way to go.
Amit Rathore asks, what does the hold option mean in value research premium? Does it mean that he should sell?
Well, these are the funds which do not meet our high expectations in terms of the performance or the consistency of it, or the costs, or the stability of the fund management team, etc. So these are the kind of parameters that we evaluate funds on. And in case of a fund which is viewed as a hold, they generally do not meet our high expectations in this respect. But having said that, we also do not have any concerns of the kind on these funds that we ask you to sell them immediately. So for instance, there may be better performers around which make up our buy list, but these funds may not be outright poor performers themselves. And that's why we believe that if you have investments in them already, you can continue to remain invested in them. Now, having said that, you may take a call on exiting these funds for a few reasons. One is that if they make up for a very small portion of your overall portfolio in the first place, so they don't matter a lot, really. They don't make any meaningful contribution in your portfolio anyways. That's one. Second is, if you're running a large portfolio in terms of the number of funds, and you're looking to cut down on a few funds from your portfolio, then certainly the ones which are tagged as hold should come up first for pruning down before you closely start looking at the buy ones. So those are the kind of reasons why you should consider exiting a fund which is tagged as a hold.
Okay, now Rishi Kapoor wishes to start investing in the index through SIP, and he asks which is better, index funds or ETFs, and which index should he be tracking?
Well, first of all, both are passive forms of investing. So both index funds and ETFs would typically track an index and endeavor to deliver you the returns similar to that of an index. Now, while choosing between the two, there are a few parameters that may be of relevance. One is costs. Now, on the cost fronts, ETFs have an advantage because you can get exposure to an index for as low a cost as just 5 to 7 basis points. Now, in case of index funds, they are also fairly economically priced, but for a direct plan, you might incur a cost of say 10 to 15 basis points. So while ETFs have an advantage, but index funds do not lag on that front by a wide margin. That's one. Second important factor is the liquidity of these funds. Now, in case of index funds, liquidity is not an issue because the fund company stands committed to honor your redemption request on any working day at the prevailing NAV. But in case of ETFs, liquidity may not be the same across all funds because the only way, by and large, for retail investors, the viable route for them to exit an ETF is on a stock exchange, just like an equity stock. So over there, you need to check what are the kind of trading volumes that an ETF is able to generate, and whether those trading volumes are good enough for your scale of investment. If you were to exit this fund, would you be able to conveniently and comfortably do that given the trading volumes of the ETF? So those are the kind of considerations that you should keep in mind. Now, typically investors who otherwise do not invest in stocks and therefore do not own a trading or a demat account find it much more convenient and much more hassle-free to invest in index funds, because it saves them from the effort of opening and maintaining a demat and a trading account. But investors who do invest in stocks as well, for them ETFs can also be a viable option. So those are the kind of considerations one can keep in mind while deciding which one to opt for. Now, to answer his second question about which index should he choose to buy an index fund, well, I'd say that he can look at funds which are tracking either the Nifty or the BSE Sensex, because in this kind of a segment, you have plenty of good and efficient ETFs and index funds which come at a fairly low cost. Now, there are a few index funds available which also track the mid cap index, but the point is that the investment case for passive investing in the mid cap segment is much weaker at the moment. And also there could be issues around the replicability of the index as the size of these funds grow. So for now, I would suggest that one should stick to the funds tracking the Nifty or the index, the Nifty or the Sensex, as far as passive investing is concerned.
All right, the next query has been sent in by Jayesh Udani, and he asks, why is PGIM India Global Equity Opportunities Fund unrated? Does it mean it's risky to invest in?
Well, the PGIM India Global Equity Opportunities Fund is unrated simply because we do not rate funds in the international equity category. The precondition for funds to get rated in a particular category is that they all should be comparable. They all should by and large have a similar universe of stocks or similar universe of securities from which they make their selection and build their portfolio. But that's not the case in case of international equity category, because different funds have a very different investment mandate. So some funds are country specific, some funds focus on a particular theme, some funds prefer to invest in developed markets, while there are others which focus on emerging markets. So they are quite a motley bunch and therefore are not strictly comparable with each other. And that's why we do not rate them. But having said that, this PGIM fund has built up quite a compelling track record in the last 1 year when it has turned blockbuster.
Okay, now NV Vittal says, after the budget, bond yields have gone up and the returns on debt mutual funds have taken a hit. Will it stabilize or still head south? Are there alternatives to these debt funds like equity savings funds, balanced advantage funds, or arbitrage funds for the next 3 to 4 years?
Well, bond funds have taken a hit post-budget. That's because the yields of bonds have increased. And that in turn has happened because of the higher than expected borrowing program announced by the government in the remaining of the current financial year as well as the next financial year. So fund managers worry that how would the markets be able to absorb this magnitude of borrowing, and the supply of bonds that would be coming through can have a downward pressure on the prices of the bonds and increase or raise the yields of these bonds. So that's what has contributed to the negative returns. And while we see negative returns across the board, but different categories of debt funds have suffered different magnitudes of negative returns. Now, whether they would continue to head south, of course, nobody can say that with certainty, but generally there is an expectation of an upward bias on yields because of the overhang of the borrowing program. Even though fund managers and broadly the bond markets hope and anticipate that RBI would intervene more aggressively by buying bonds, by buying the government securities through its open market operations to prevent the yields from rising substantially. So while the upward pressure on yields cannot be ruled out from here on, but markets hope that it should be fairly range bound given the active participation and active intervention by RBI. Now, coming to the second part of his question around the suitable investment avenues for a 3 to 4 year horizon, I would say that it should predominantly be in debt with safer debt instruments towards the shorter end of the maturity, but he can look to add a limited measure of equity to boost returns. So from that perspective, equity savings funds can be a suitable option with their small, about a third of exposure to equity, and the remaining made up of high quality bonds as well as certain arbitrage opportunities. So those are the kind of funds I believe could fit the bill in this case. Now he also mentioned about arbitrage funds. Of course, those funds would be much lower on volatility, but they would at best deliver returns similar to those of liquid funds. And I believe those are suboptimal for an investment horizon of 3 to 4 years.
Raghunath Seth is a Value Research Premium subscriber. Should he go for the set of funds suggested by Portfolio Planner or choose from the ones shown in Analyst Choice section?
Well, the funds are not different across the two. What you get as suggestions from Portfolio Planner are picked from the analyst choice list by our algorithms. So the point is that for a more discerning investor who can build the portfolio or who can build his portfolio on his own, can look at the analyst choice list where we provide our handpicked list of 40 to 45 funds, and which are good enough to build a portfolio for just about any investing need. So it greatly adds value by taking away the stress of having to sift through hundreds of funds across several categories that mutual funds have to offer, and presenting this concise list of 40-45 funds. Not only that, these funds are classified into 5 to 7 broad buckets which are investor centric and classified according to different investing needs. So taken together, this list greatly simplifies the job of picking suitable funds for an investor. But for those who find even this confusing and who are wanting further hand holding, can use the portfolio planner tool, whereby answering a few objective questions, they are given a set of fund suggestions. So broadly, you can feel free to use the analyst choice list to build your portfolio, but for an algorithm driven set of suggestions, come to portfolio planner.
S. Mohan wants to know if it's worth investing in gilt funds after the budget, as the government has a huge borrowing target.
Well, gilt funds make sense during times of falling interest rates, because gilt funds benefit the most from falling interest rates, but they also suffer the most when interest rates start to rise. So that's why they are meant to play a tactical allocation role in a portfolio at a time when interest rates are falling. And ideally, investors should consider exiting them when there is a trend reversal and the interest rates start to rise. Now, in that context, we are at a stage where more interest rate cuts are not anticipated. It is largely believed that the interest rates have bottomed out, and the RBI may consider starting to increase interest rates sometime late in the next financial year or the one after, depending upon how the macroeconomic factors unfold. So from that standpoint, it is not an opportune time to invest in gilt funds.
Anil Sukumaran's daughter is an NRI and wants to invest in mutual funds. Her time horizon is 7 years and she's 27 years old. She's investing for higher returns. So he's asked for your advice on funds that are suitable and the formalities to invest in mutual funds for NRIs.
Well, I'd suggest that given her time horizon, she can consider aggressive hybrid funds, which should be suitable for her investment horizon. That's one. Now, in terms of the formalities for an NRI, one is that you can invest through an NRE or an NRO account, because fund companies do not accept investments in foreign currency. So that's one. Second is, to be able to invest, she would need to complete some onboarding and some KYC formalities, and she would need to go through some documentation. She would need to furnish documents like her PAN card, her passport, an address proof for her foreign residence, and things like that. Also, if she is a US or a Canadian citizen, then she would have to comply with some additional requirements under the FATCA rules, and she would need to fill up these additional forms. In fact, because of these additional FATCA compliance requirements, some fund houses do not accept investments from US or Canadian citizens. So those are the kind of formalities that she would have to complete. And also bear in mind that for an NRI, there are TDS laws which are applicable on capital gains. So while the overall applicability of capital gains for an NRI is same as a resident Indian, But in case of NRIs, a fund house is liable to deduct TDS from the capital gains accruing to them at the time of redemption.
Today's last question has been sent in by Swapnil Mangle, who wants to understand how the new NAV applicability rule post-fund realization at AMC works. Won't this be a hurdle for opportunistic investing besides regular SIP? Swapnil wants to know.
So let me first explain what has changed. Until now, what used to happen was that in case of an investment of under rupees 2 lakh, if the application to invest money was made to the fund house before the cutoff time, which in case of equity funds is 3 p.m., then the units were allotted on the NAV of the same day. So now even though the money may not have hit the bank account of the scheme in question, but the units would still be allotted the same day. For instance, if an investor invests through the check, typically it can take 1 or 2 days for the check to get cleared and the money to hit the bank account. And during this 2-3 day period, if the markets were to rise, then this investor would derive an advantage because he would get to participate in those gains, even though the money may not have even left his or her bank account. And this advantage would come at the expense of existing investors who would have to share those gains with this new investor. So now SEBI has plugged this gap by saying that you would be allotted units on the NAV of the day when the money actually reaches the fund house. So it makes the system fairer for all investors. Until now, this rule was applicable on investments of greater than rupees 2 lakh, but now it has been made applicable on all investments irrespective of the amount. Now this has come into effect from 1st of February, and there has been some noise around it because this has been the time when the markets have made some substantial gains in a few trading days, and investors who were looking to benefit from this post-budget rally have felt disappointed because of the delays in allotting the NAV, and therefore it has come at a bit of an opportunity loss as they've not been able to benefit from the gain of these few trading sessions. But really the idea is that mutual funds are not meant for such opportunistic investing. For investors who are looking to derive any benefit of this short-term nature, can perhaps try their luck by investing directly in stocks, and they should only commit their long-term money to mutual funds, and over a long term a delay by a day or two should not matter much.
Well, with that, it's a wrap on this episode of Helpline. Thank you, Ashutosh.
Thank you.
Thank you to all our viewers. You can go to VR Helpline on Value Research online and send us the questions that are stopping you from investing today. Our team will answer them in the upcoming Q&A session. Bye for now.